Okay. Hello everyone, good afternoon everybody. Thank you all for coming out today in this rain and everything. Thank you, we appreciate it. Also a special thank you to the Church of the Advocate and Pastor Name for allowing us to use this space today. And welcome to Palestine and Black America, a strategy for liberation. First, just want to introduce myself. My name is Eman, and I go to Temple University. And I'm just going to be helping facilitate this forum today. And this forum is coming from Temple Students for Justice in Palestine and the Saturday Free School. And the reason, basically, we have invited you all here today because this past spring, SJP decided that we needed to start a new subgroup within the organization whose purpose would be to help educate and inform the members of SJP on the complex political and theoretical histories of American Palestinian revolutionary movements. So we created the Political Education Committee, and our committee has been hosting various reading groups over the summer, and these reading groups are focusing on works by Palestinians and African Americans such as George Habash, Huey Newton, Leonard Khalid, and W.E.B. Du Bois. So we want to ensure that as active members in our school and in the Philadelphia community, that we make a point of trying to share revolutionary knowledge with people that are willing to learn. And so in continuation of those summer reading groups that we had, we organized this forum today. And so now I'm just going to quickly go through the plan for the rest of the afternoon so we all know what to expect. First, we're going to open with two presentations by Brandon Doe and Dr. Monteiro. And then that'll help us set the tone for the rest of the continuation of the afternoon. And then we'll have some brief entertainment by Megna Chandra and Ibrahim. And then we're going to transition to letter readings and the discussion portion led by our very own Samir and Serafina Harris. And then the final portion of today would be facilitated group discussion. It will be based on everything that we're going to hear today and learn about today. And so yeah, that's what's going to happen. So I hope you guys make yourselves comfortable. There's refreshments in the back. The bathroom is back there. And yeah, so make yourselves comfortable. And without further ado, pass it to the next presenter, who is Brandon Doe.
Everyone, assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Eman, for the introduction, and also thank you everyone for coming today and making it through the rain. Just briefly before I start my presentation, it's important to acknowledge that we are here in the Church of the Advocate, which is a place where the Black radical tradition has taken place over many years. As you can see in the mural behind me, the Black Panther Convention happened here in 1970. Eman Abuawdeh also spoke here. Eman Abuawdeh, who must be freed. And also a long list of revolutionaries, a long list of tradition of resistance has taken place in this building. And we really wanted this to be in continuation of that struggle. I wrote this article, The World in Palestine, toward a new vision for the Palestine Solidarity movement. I wrote this article because of the need for truth in the movement. And the people I had in mind were, just the young people who are very optimistic and enthusiastic and want to make a difference, but are in many ways under a heavy ideological attack. And although this article was specifically about the Palestine Solidarity movement, I also wanted to broaden it to all youth, whether they are in the so-called movement or not, because we are under a heavy ideological attack, and just in this time of war and in this time of crisis, we need a way to find our place in the world and our role in changing it, and we can do that with political education. So, without further ado, I'm just going to begin. In light of the United States' key role in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the Palestine Solidarity movement in America has immense potential. Its young organizers possess the determination needed to wage a struggle against the causes of war and poverty, and the moral courage to stand with the world's oppressed and exploited masses. However, the movement all too often has divorced itself from the global struggle for peace, and to its own detriment, has yet to confront Zionism for its pivotal role in securing the interests of U.S. imperialism beyond Palestine. We observe this when the nonprofit-driven sector of the Palestine Solidarity movement aligned with the interests of Israel and through its support behind Western intervention to overthrow the Syrian government. This came at a moment when the United States was threatening to implement a no-fly zone over Syria, which aimed to provoke war with Russia and had the potential to result in a nuclear catastrophe. Ending the occupation is often reduced to a question of national liberation. However, this conception of Palestine as an issue separate from the need for a world movement for peace fails to confront the foundations of Israel and its role in imperialism. Thus, it does not have the capacity to truly free Palestine and humanity as a whole, both of which are threatened daily with extinction by the American war machine. Zionism serves the ruling class's interests in partitioning the continents of Africa and Asia for the exploitation of their people and theft of their resources. And for 70 years, Israel has been the biggest purveyor of war and chaos in what colonizers called the Middle East. Although ambitious campaigns have recently been launched in America in the name of Black and Palestinian solidarity, none have unveiled the true nature of the State of Israel and Palestine's connection with the struggle of oppressed people worldwide. For this young movement to advance to a stage where it can truly threaten Israel's foundation, it must understand Zionism for what it is, an attack on the unity of the civilizations of Africa and Asia in the interest of capitalist gain. Operating from within the center of the global war machine, the Palestine Solidarity movement in America must build principal unity with Black America and the immigrant and white working class in order to expose the lies of imperialist propaganda. By building a united front that recognizes the centrality of the ideological struggle on the question of war and peace inside and outside of Palestine, the Palestine Solidarity movement in America will develop a greater understanding of the world in order to change it. Political education is central in our struggle for freedom. George Habash, the founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, highlighted the importance of raising the Arab world's consciousness in order to wage a united struggle against Zionism. The Pflp, a Marxist-Leninist organization, was founded in 1967 in the wake of the Six-Day War, in which Israel captured the West Bank in Palestine, the Golan Heights in Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. The Pflp stands today as the most ideologically clear organization in the Palestinian liberation movement. This clarity is exemplified in its rejection of the concessions made by the Arabist leadership class, which has supported so-called peace agreements with Israel. These agreements have allowed the forces of occupation to extend deeper into Palestine and diminish the chances of Palestinian liberation. In his 2000 article, Palestine Between Dreams and Reality, Habash identified the partitioning of Asia and Africa as the driving motive behind the creation of Israel. And he says, a Zionist state would serve colonial interests by acting as a wall dividing the Arab East on the Asian continent from the Arab West in Africa, and as a police station securing the passage to India, the pearl in the British crown. The PFLP's historical materialist analysis of Israel identifies the partitioning of the Arab world as a key maneuver in the larger imperialist division scheme of Asian and African civilizations. This method of analysis also allows the organization to deliver a critique of those who obscure the reality of class contradictions within Palestine and the complicity of Palestinians who sell out their own people to Zionism. Habash and the PFLP have understood that the enemies of the people are not defined by color or nationality, but rather by where they stand in relation to imperialism. Imperialism cannot be understood today without reference to what Ghanaian revolutionary Kwame Nkrumah called Neocolonialism, or imperialism's desperate effort to export the social conflicts of capitalist countries to the formerly colonized world, which is now symbolically free but enslaved in reality. Neocolonialism trades direct domination for an illusion of sovereignty while maintaining economic dominance over the world's majority, along with ideological dominance over institutions that produce knowledge. Instead of educating youth to serve humanity, universities such as Temple program young people to passively accept poverty, displacement, and militarized state violence, which it inflicts throughout the city of Philadelphia. It makes students see this as an unchangeable condition of humanity. In addition, neocolonialism manifests itself in the form of constant warfare, which aims to partition former colonies in order to make them subservient to Western power. These wars have the grave potential to escalate into catastrophic war between nuclear powers. Building on Lenin's analysis of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, characterized by war, economic depression, and the formation of a ruling class that exerts its dominance over the economies of the non-Western world, Nkrumah traces the root of neocolonialism to the partitioning of Asia and Africa into small states entirely dependent on the capital and resources of neocolonial economies. By keeping the majority of humanity partitioned into superficially independent states, European and American imperialists are able to extract surplus profits from the working people of Asia and Africa. By understanding Lenin's concept of stages of capitalism, we can trace capitalism's transformation into imperialism and imperialism's transition to neocolonialism as its last and most dangerous stage. Created at the demise of the colonial era, Israel, itself a creation of the colonial powers, was able to leech off the legacy of colonialism and develop into a neo-colonial force in its own right. Since its formation, Israel has taken up the task of dividing Western Asia and Northern Africa by fueling wars within the region in order to put more money into the pockets of imperialists. After Britain's massive post-World War II debt and defeat by the Indian independence movement in 1947, the State of Israel was founded the following year in 1948. This was an attempt by the ruling class to reconsolidate colonial power after a devastating loss in India, Britain's most prized possession. The 1949 Armistice Agreement and the Tripartite Declaration of 1950 gave the West Bank and Gaza to the British-aligned Egyptian and Jordanian governments and allowed Palestine's natural resources to flow freely into the hands of Israel and Europe. Israel's footprints of terror can be seen all over Asia and Africa. In North Africa, Israel played a key role in partitioning Sudan and encouraging Christians and Muslims to murder each other while Israeli firms smuggled gold and uranium to the occupied territories. This adds to Israel's ongoing robbery in Africa,
which was also carried out in the diamond mines of the Congo and Angola. In addition, Israel fuels wars throughout Western Asia and Northern Africa. The divide and conquer strategy of Israel is evident in its alliance with Saudi Arabia and wars against Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Lebanon. All of these actions highlight Israel's role as a weapon of neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. George Habash stated that the true enemy of the Palestinians is not just the state of Israel, but American imperialism, whose interests are protected by Zionism. Israel's development into a neo-colonial apparatus was exemplified in 1993 by the signing of the Oslo Accords, which created the Palestinian Authority, a Zionist front with an Arab face, whose purpose is to carry out the work of Israel. The Oslo Accords were signed 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the biggest supporter of the Palestinian liberation movement. Just like neocolonialism strengthens its ideological counter-revolution by propping up black leaders in Africa and the United States, Israel does the same with Arab figureheads in Palestine and the Palestine Solidarity movement, a move that has diminished the cohesion of resistance among the American left. Israel directly profits from a Palestinian labor force that is maintained with the help of the Arab misleadership class. This use of identity politics allows Israel to disguise its neo-colonial violence with the illusion of Arab sovereignty. In the United States today, we see the effects of neo-colonialism in the exploitation of immigrants as a cheap labor force. Immigrant labor is converted into profits and used to further gentrify and police poor and historically working class black communities, such as those of North and West Philadelphia. The use of one group of oppressed people as a weapon against another is a strategy that is implemented throughout neo-colonial states and is also used to burn bridges between the multiracial working class in America. In Palestine, this strategy can be seen in Israel's policy of recruiting Ethiopian migrants to fuel the occupation by joining the Israel Defense Forces. Many immigrants flee countries whose politics and economy have been destroyed by imperialism and come to the United States in search of a more stable living situation. However, the anti-blackness indoctrinated into immigrants by ruling class propaganda prevents them from seeing their connection with the black working class. This keeps the masses fighting amongst each other and lets the capitalists who exploit both groups off the hook. Thus, the struggle of uniting across the color line to defeat racism becomes one with the struggle to defeat imperialism, whose effects are visible not only in Africa and Asia, but also in the streets of America's collapsing empire. The wealth of the imperial powers is built on the starvation of the darker peoples of the world, including the dark poor and working class in the United States. It is no coincidence that within the same time frame of Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge, during which Israel used the world's most advanced military weapons to murder Palestinians by the thousands, the rate of child hunger in Black North Philadelphia rose by over 300%. What ties humanity together in a single garment of destiny is the responsibility we have to defeat our common enemy in the struggle to free humanity as a whole. Neocolonialism's search for new, more insidious ways to exploit indicates a dying system. In his 1947 book, The World in Africa, Du Bois predicted that the collapse of European civilization would create the conditions for the freedom of humanity. With the chaos among European nations and the United States today, the rise of humanity is closer than ever. The paramount task of the Palestine Solidarity movement is to unite the people under the common objective of defeating imperialism to attain world peace, which is characterized not by the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. It is about identifying the main cause of human suffering so that we can know the correct path of struggle, rather than attacking a symptom of the system at the cost of coming to a correct analysis of its root cause. In prioritizing political education, it is also crucial to understand the purpose of miseducation, to make the people believe that their enemies are their friends and their friends are their enemies. To accurately grasp the stage of history we are situated in today is to know our enemies and their weak points, and to know who our allies are, so that we can forge a clear path forward in our struggle against the ruling class. Ignoring Israel's direct role in carrying out the work of the U.S. war machine will come at the cost of separating the Palestine Solidarity movement from its connection with the complete liberation of humanity from imperialism. Rather than a surface-level solidarity based on oppressed identities, we must build a unity of humankind against the forces of imperialism that seek to destroy the world's civilizations for wealth and power. Immigrants in the United States who are taught to abandon their own struggle for assimilation into the white world must reject the illusion of the American dream and side with Black America against the capitalists who exploit them both. By doing so, they will break the psychological chains of white supremacy and overturn the system that creates the ideological conditions for Israeli neocolonialism to thrive in America and in Palestine. To do this, we cannot see Palestine as an issue unto itself. We must strive to develop a dialectical understanding of Palestine and the world and Palestine. We can begin by anchoring ourselves in the tradition of resistance put forth by George Habash, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Kwame Nkrumah, who all asserted that the future of humanity ultimately rests in the hands of the darker peoples of the world. It is a tradition that exposes the propaganda of the ruling class, that teaches young people they are powerless against the war machine, and that their only way out is to exploit their brothers and sisters in the name of the American dream, rather than struggle to change society. It is the cure for the pessimism that permeates Western culture and poisons movements fighting to build a vision for humanity to overcome the triple evils of poverty, racism, and war. This heroic spirit of the Palestinian and Black radical traditions lives on in everyday people, and we struggle to keep it alive by following their example. By embracing our shared destiny with Black America and those living under the degradation of imperialism worldwide, the Palestine Solidarity movement in the United States will say that a free Palestine is possible, and that with struggle, we can restore humanity back to its rightful place, where the civilizations of the world are once again united and no longer living under the threat of invasion, partitioning, and mass exploitation. This tradition instills within our souls a great sense of humility and revolutionary sacrifice that is born out of an unconditional love for the people, a love that understands why people are the way they are, but also realizes the potential of who they can become. We must strive to lead humanity out of the darkness of imperialism until not one child remains hungry, until not one child has to endure another war, whether that child be in North Philadelphia or Palestine. Next, I would like to introduce my mentor and my comrade, Dr. Monteiro.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to say to Brandon, it was a wonderful presentation to open this up. And I really would like to thank the Students for Justice in Palestine at Temple University. It's not easy in this country at this time to stand up for what is right, especially at these universities that are no longer places for discussion and dialogue and debate, but where young people are being forced to conform and to find a way to adjust to injustice. But Students for Justice in Palestine are resisting that, and I'd like to congratulate them. And I really would like to thank them for reaching out to the Saturday Free School and welcoming us to be a part of this event. You know, the Saturday Free School is approaching its 7th year, and we have been trying to educate the people of Philadelphia and also the people around this country, if possible, because the great issue of our time, and of all times like this, is the issue of being on the right side of history, of understanding history, and as they say, nothing is more powerful than ideas whose time has come. And to know the truth is to know that which can free you from oppression. So we've been trying to conduct ourselves in a principled and disciplined way in the conduct of the ideological struggle in a situation of confusion. And of course this relates to all of the issues of solidarity. And I think this meeting is of special significance because it joins in its efforts two people, the Palestinian people and the African American people, whose oppression are what I call all humanity questions. That is to say, not only is the Palestinian question for Palestinians or Arabs or for Muslims or for progressive people, it is a question for all of humanity because it, in a large measure, decides humanity's future. That is the same with the African American people's struggle, our long resistance to the most powerful system of oppression perhaps that humanity has ever seen, not from afar, but in the belly of the beast. And hence our struggle engages and involves all of humanity. If for no other reason, ours is a great moral imperative for humanity. And our greatest leaders have made that point to humanity, and humanity, to its benefit and to ours, have responded to us in our greatest moments of struggle. But I think at the core of the solidarity of the two peoples is the unity and solidarity of their working classes and of their poor. It is seldom in meetings of solidarity that involve the Palestinian people that the issue of the Palestinian worker and the Palestinian poor are brought up. We must acknowledge that the system of apartheid and occupation that is engineered by the Zionist state of Israel is a system of super exploitation of labor. It is to create a divided working class between the Israelis and the Palestinians for the purpose of super exploiting the Palestinian workers and exploiting the Israeli workers. At one time,
there was a vision most accurately crystallized in the ideology and line of the Israeli and Palestinian Communist parties for unity of these two working classes for the benefit of both. The consolidation of the ruthless system of rule that now exists in Israel, which tries to portray itself as having to exist in the form that it does in order to defend democracy in Israel. At one time, that regime could never have been imagined in Israel because of the existence of progressive forces, including Israeli and Palestinian trade unions and communist parties and revolutionary forces in both nations. But then that brings us to the African American working class. There are many people who wish to talk about the African American people and not once mention the African American working class and the African American poor, which in many ways are inseparable. To be an African American worker is almost to be poor in this country. To have your children hungry, to live in a neighborhood that is segregated and to go to schools that are collapsing. In some ways, when you describe the African American working class, it's like you're talking about the Palestinian working class. Now, to speak of these two people and their working classes, in a lot of ways, is to speak about the future. Because once you seriously talk about the working class, you're talking about the opposition or the opposite of the capitalist class. Because the working class exists in the current system to be exploited and to produce profits for a certain class. But to say that is not to say enough. Because at the end of the day, the Israeli regime is modeled upon the American regime. And what is the American regime? Well, today we speak a lot about the deep state. And I think that is accurate, however insufficient. Because what we are talking about is not just a deep state, but a form of class rule over the majority. But then to say that is not even to say enough. Because what is the nature of the class rule under which we live in the United States and upon which the Israeli regime models itself? I would argue that in the United States, in spite of all the propaganda, we live under the most ruthless form of the dictatorship of the financial oligarchy. The most ruthless form of it. Now, of course, many would say this is a mode of historical revisionism. Because wasn't Nazi Germany the most ruthless form of the dictatorship of capital? Wasn't fascist Italy that? And isn't fascism, by its very definition, the most brutal dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of the capitalist class? And I would argue that if you were talking about the 1920s and 30s and 40s it would be accurate to say that Hitler's Germany, maybe Mussolini's Italy, perhaps Spain, were forms of the most brutal dictatorship of finance capital of that time. But history does not stand still. All systems evolve, and the form of rule of a class has to take into account the conditions under which that rule occurs. And to understand the nature of the dictatorship in this country, you first have to acknowledge that there's been no empire the likes of the American empire. Almost 1,000 military bases throughout the world, armed with the most sophisticated weapons, including nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. A regime that at the end of the day is committed to holding on to its empire and power by any means necessary. Now, the fact that we do not view, even progressives do not view, the form of class rule in this country is a tribute to how thorough this ruthless dictatorship itself is, because it originates in the control of the mind, the control of ideology, the control of thought. So thorough is this rule that even progressives do not understand it and believe that we live in something close to a democracy, a bourgeois democracy. It is not that, sadly. And perhaps the greatest testament to what it is the enduring oppression of black workers, trapped in the most thorough system of exploitation and hunger, for whom it is difficult, after almost 400 years, to speak of progress. Now I'm talking about the working class. Certainly, the heroic struggles of the black worker has led to concessions from the American ruling class, but concessions that have gone disproportionately to the top 10% of black people. And certainly we now have our billionaires and our bourgeoisie and our parasites. But let us be real. They are dependent upon the largesse of the dominant class. But if you look at the black worker, you don't have to go far beyond North Philadelphia. And when you say the black worker, you're talking about the hunger of their children. Their children not being educated. Their children and they themselves being under constant police control. You're talking about 1.5 million black men that cannot be accounted for in any measure. This exposes the nature of the class dictatorship in this country, the fact of black oppression. Similarly, to understand the nature of the Palestinian struggle at this time, you have to understand the Palestinian worker. That was not necessarily the case in 1970, when you could talk about a general Palestinian struggle, a general Palestinian uprising, and speak of the PLO as the main representative of the Palestinian people. But today, things have changed. And though I do not and would not attempt to speak for the Palestinian struggle, it would seem to me that the struggle of the Palestinian people is more anchored to the struggle of its working class than ever before in its history. If we talk about a West Bank elite, if we talk about a Palestinian authority that enriches a part of the Palestinian people, the question that we have to ask is, at whose expense? And of course, that takes us back to the working class. I'd just like to say a few things, and Brandon drew attention to the theorizing of Kwame Nkrumah, who in 1965 published a landmark study entitled Neocolonialism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism. And in a lot of ways, that is an accurate portrayal. And certainly for Africa, in the 1960s, when Nkrumah wrote the book, there was no question that the highest stage of imperialist domination of Africa was neocolonialism. But I would suggest that to understand imperialism, we have to understand it not only as a stage in the development of capitalism, and that is the Leninist thesis, that imperialism is the highest stage of the development of capitalism. And I really do agree with Brandon here that to understand solidarity of any peoples in the world today, and certainly the solidarity between Palestinian and black folk, you have to understand imperialism. And you have to understand that the struggle must be not just for solidarity in general, but anti-imperialist solidarity. Which, of course, if imperialism is the highest stage of the development of capitalism and the struggle for solidarity is anti-imperialist, we're talking finally about the working class, who is more consistently bound to the fight against capitalist exploitation. But if we trace the appearance of imperialism as a stage of capitalism to the 1880s, I think we would have to acknowledge that imperialism itself has gone through several stages of development. Approximately 1880 to 1913 could be considered the first stage of the general crisis of capitalism, or the first stage of imperialism. That is approximately from the First World Depression to 1913, the onset of what would have been a great global depression for economic depression for capitalism, were it not for the beginning of World War I. It is with World War I and the Russian Revolution that we begin the second stage of imperialism. This stage includes the most unstable period in the history of capitalism. That is both the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and World War II, and World War I, I should say, as well. The third stage begins with the end of World War II and the rise of the anti-colonial independence movements and the consolidation of a community of socialist nations, including the Soviet Union, China, the Eastern European nations, eventually Vietnam and Korea, North Korea, and Cuba. This stage is perhaps the most important stage of the offensive of the anti-colonial and revolutionary forces. The fourth stage lasts from approximately 1975 to 2008. It is a long period. It is a period of capitalist stabilization. The reason I want to mention that is because to understand that fourth stage helps us to understand where we are today. In particular, when the United States says in 1971 that it will no longer honor gold as a currency, a universal currency, and said that the dollar would be the equivalency of gold, establishing at that moment the unquestioned financial and economic dominance of the United States over the entire world capitalist system. Without getting into a lot of detail, that lasted until 2008, and the financial collapse, an event which was never to occur according to the economists of capitalism, a financial collapse on the level of the 1929 collapse which led to the Great Depression. We are now in the fifth stage of the general crisis of capitalism. The stability that was achieved in the fourth stage is no longer. The system has been destabilized, and throughout the capitalist world, the main countries of capitalism, not only is there economic uncertainty, but now deep, profound, and I would say irreversible political chaos. And the United States is a principal center of this. If you understand 2016 and the eruptions in both the Democratic and Republican parties and the rise of mass resistance to the corporate leadership of both parties and the straining towards the formation of a new political alignment on the basis of the interests. And I would cut through all the garbage of CNN and MSNBC and the corporate media. I do agree they're the enemies of the people. If we cut through all of that, what we saw in the election of 2016 was the coming to the fore of the interests and protests of working people in this country. You don't have Trump as the president without that upsurge, which meant that there were working people that voted for him and working people, especially black working people, that stayed at home and didn't vote for either, hence giving the balance in key states to Donald Trump. But irrespective of who became the president, what was decisive and remains decisive is the upsurge of working people and their demand that they be heard and their interests be taken into account in the politics of the country. In this fifth stage, not only is there chaos in the capitalist world, but there's chaos throughout the world politically, and this involves Israel. The Israeli people must now decide how and if they will exist as a people in this world. They will have to decide that. And the first question that they will have to decide is not whether Israel will exist, but what is their relationship to the Palestinian people, the main victims of their ruthless rule? That is the question for the Israeli people and for the Israeli working class. And just lastly, let us not forget, and too often we do forget, when we look at oppressive regimes, be it here or in Israel, that each nation has a working class. That even when they are temporarily defeated, the resilience of the working class, their political parties, and the ideology of the working class has a way of reasserting itself. Zionism, and especially its most vicious form of expression today, is not the only ideology of the Jewish people in the past or now. Every Israeli is not a Zionist. Every Jew is not a Zionist. There is a tradition among the Jewish people of a radicalism that challenges Zionism, always has been and exists today.
That's right.
You know, and I just, maybe I'll tell, if I could just tell a little story. You know, I was one of those people that came up in the left of the 1970s. And I joined the Communist Party. That was one of the best choices I ever made in my life politically. And it has paid tremendous dividends right up till today. And really, it makes it possible for me to share experiences with my younger colleagues that I don't think they could get anywhere else. But the Communist Party had many Jewish people, many immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe. And these were some of the finest people in the United States. And I think back to that time, their selflessness expressed itself in the fact that I never heard them mention Israel, or that Israel had to exist. Those Jewish fighters for peace and racial justice put the African American people's struggle ahead of theirs. In fact, I never heard them mention the Holocaust. And I'm talking about people like Philip Foner and Herbert Aptheker, and some you wouldn't know, like Hyman Loomer, a great friend.
Some of us do.
Yeah, I'm glad you do, Hyman Loomer. And many, many others, as you know. They put the black struggle ahead of what was supposed to be their own struggle. And they saw black oppression and the freedom of black people as the key to the freedom of the nation and all peoples in it. We are obligated to say to all people fighting for the freedom of Palestine and call upon every Jewish fighter for peace and freedom to hearken back and anchor yourself in the greatest of your traditions if you wish to exist into the 21st century. We African Americans are going through some difficult times. What makes us struggle, please don't forgive me if I talk too long. What makes our struggle very difficult these days is that, you know, we've produced some of the great leaders in history. We just don't seem to be producing the type of leaders in politics and art, and music, and other fields that we have traditionally produced. That's a great deficit for the American struggle, the American nation itself, but it's a great deficit for us. too many of our leaders and our thinkers have been bought off by corporate universities, by corporations, by non-governmental organizations and philanthropists and so on and so forth. So we're not giving to the world and to ourselves the type of leadership that we need. It makes it difficult for us. It makes it difficult for us in a time where our oppression, which is the most ruthless in the nation, is obscured by a political discourse that serves the interests of one of the two parties. But let me assure you that there are many of us from the past, long ago, if you want to look at it that way, and from the now time, that are committed to freedom, that are committed to justice, who are prepared, if necessary, to put the interest of humanity itself ahead of our own immediate interest, who say that to be a revolutionary is to recognize what King said, we're all wrapped in a single garment of destiny, that we revolutionaries begin with a moral imperative to tell the truth, to know the truth, and to stand up for it. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so